All right, welcome back, and I hope you enjoyed your lunch and the lunch break and conversation. We now move to the final section of our day and of our conference, two separate sessions as laid out in your program books. This one will involve both Michael Beckerman and James Loeffler, who I will introduce formally in a moment, and the Saguaro trio based here at the Colburn School. Michael Beckerman, I think, needs no further explanation, let alone introduction. I think we all appreciate Michael Beckerman's many gifts, and again, a very small bit of detail of his work is included in the program book. However, we're now being introduced at this conference for the first time with Professor James Loeffler. He's Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of Virginia, where he teaches modern Jewish history and culture. James is also the advisor for a very interesting organization and very musically wonderful organization in Washington, D.C. called Pro Musica Hebraica, which features music, Jewish music from many eras and genres. He has many awards, many residencies and fellowships. He writes regularly for the New Republic. He writes regularly and delightfully provocatively for the New Republic, for Tablet, and for many other publications. Brilliant scholar, and this session he has put together with Mike Beckerman, and I know we're all going to enjoy it. So first I will introduce James Loeffler to begin. James?
Thank you. Let me also start by welcoming the musicians to the stage, and I'll explain in a second what we're actually going to do together. But it's my pleasure and Mike Beckerman's pleasure to have the Saguaro trio as part of our presentation this afternoon, and that is Luanne Homzy on the violin, Peter Myers as our cellist, and Regulo Martinez as the pianist. We want to do something that we hope will be interactive, somewhat in the spirit of last night, which is to introduce another paper, another conversation about the themes of the conference, but to do it with music before, during, and after. And I'll say something else about that in a second. I also want to thank Bob Elias and James Conlon and Marilyn Ziering and the Colburn School for a chance, as we've all said, to be part of a truly special event. So I'm going to say a few remarks here, and then we're going to turn to the music. I want to start with an old Soviet joke about music, and the joke goes like this. The conductor of a new ensemble is introducing his musicians to the press corps, and he proudly points out how diverse the ensemble is. It's got all the nationalities of the USSR included, and he says, here we have Petrov, he's a Russian. Here we have Petrenko, he's Ukrainian. Here we have Petrosian, he's an Armenian. And here we have Rabinovich, he is a violinist. I think this is a good way to start because it speaks to what I hope to convey in my remarks and to explore in conversation with the musicians and with Mike Beckerman, which is the way in which when we look at this topic about censorship and music and totalitarianism, we find a very different image if we move further east into the Soviet context. And there we find many of these themes about Jewishness, about censorship in terms of an open secret, right? Everybody knows what's going on. Some things can be named but not performed. Some things can be performed but not named. And some things actually operate in a very confusing, ambiguous way, and yet it's coded so that people understand, as you understand, what's going on and what can't be said. We've talked a lot about Holocaust music versus repressed music. And what I want to try and do in my remarks is say, what would this subject look like if we actually turned to not the Nazi context, right, but to the Soviet context? And what would it look like in terms of both expanding our view of this field, as many of us have come to the stage and said, there's so much more to be done, there's so many more composers to explore, but what would a blind spot that we don't know much about, we know much, much less about Soviet composers in this same period, if we learned more about them, what would this tell us not only about that chapter in Soviet modernism, but how would that change the way we might think about the other composers who we have begun to discover over the past few decades? So I want to do that in this presentation by talking about the composer Mikhail Gnesin and one piece of music. And this is an interesting piece of music because it is both, I would argue, about the Holocaust and not about the Holocaust. It is about Jewish experience of suffering, anti-Semitism, and yet it's not about that. It is not Holocaust music, I would argue. It's not Soviet war music, but it's both. And this is a paradox I'm laying out, and that's the paradox I want to try and explore with you today. To get at the paradox, though, we felt strongly that we wanted to start with the music, let you hear it, let you experience it, think it through. Then I'm going to speak for a few minutes and really introduce the context of the piece and the composer and some of the questions about its reception. Mike is going to then speak a little bit more about formal analysis and open up the piece a little bit with the help of the musicians, and then we'll return at the end for you to hear it again and then see how your perceptions about this piece and the larger genre and questions it raises may or may not change. So with that, I'm going to step back and invite Saguaro Trio to play for us Mikhail Gnesin's piano trio. Always one of those moments where you don't want to break the magic right after a piece of music ends and tell you what it's about, but I'm about to do that. PowerPoint is powering up. We'll come on in a second. So if you looked in the program note, and I didn't tell you what this piece was called. I just called it Gnesin's Trio, and that was for a reason, so as not to bias your ears about what it's supposed to be. And this is a piece of music that has a dedication in memory of our perished children, about which I'll say something else in a few minutes. But this is a piece of music, as I'm going to argue, that allows us, I think, to ask in a different way many of the questions we've already asked yesterday and today about interpretation, about meaning, about censorship, and also to ask about sort of this question that has come up several times, which is, how big is this corpus, right? Where does it start? Where does it end? Should it end at 45? What's the criterion that we use to mark it off? And one of the interesting things, if you come from the Soviet context into this conversation, as I alluded to, is that there is so much music that exists that is barely touched. This is a good example of it, I think. And that even though it has been, to some extent, hiding even more in plain sight, has been completely forgotten. Now, what I would say is there are many examples of the music of the Holocaust in the Soviet context that begin well before the iconic moment of Babi Yar, right, and Shostakovich. And one of the interesting things is there's a huge burst of creativity that we see that takes place beginning during World War II and extends into the years afterwards, which is completely forgotten today. So before Shostakovich's Babi Yar, there was Dmitry Klebanov's Babi Yar from 1945, a symphony which is called Babi Yar, and this is an excerpt from a Soviet Yiddish newspaper talking about its premiere and the event in Kharkov. That this was a great event of commemorating this disaster of Babi Yar through a full-blown symphony. This is the symphony which was played and lauded and then was yanked very shortly after its premiere with accusations that it was a piece of bourgeois religious propaganda, and that it was a piece of nationalist, Zionist propaganda, and so on and so forth. So it's there, and of course the question that we have to ask is how, what are the specific conditions in which it gets yanked, and then what happens to it afterwards. We get another, even more complicated picture if we look back at this period. If we look at Weinberg, the composer who has gotten so much acclaim and just belated recognition of late. Weinberg has famously his Moldavian Rhapsody, right, which is the piece that after its premiere, actually on the night of its premiere in 1953, he is arrested, right, and yanked off himself, carried off to prison after its premiere by Oistrakh. And he's freed from prison. Stalin dies. Shostakovich plays a role in intervening. It's still a slightly murky episode. But the bottom line is the piece continues to be in the repertoire of Soviet music. It's recorded by Oistrakh with Weinberg, and it's known as a Moldavian Rhapsody. And of course, the interesting thing about it is it's a Moldavian Rhapsody which is based on Jewish klezmer folkloric material. Well, it turns out that this piece actually was premiered in 1947, played on the radio, and here's another Yiddish newspaper article which refers to it as Weinberg's new Jewish Rhapsody, right? And so even our sense of the chronology of when things were presented and when they were repressed and what was possible and what was not is very, very murky for this period. So this leads me into the piece that we're going to focus on and that you've heard today, which is Mikhail Gnesin's trio with the dedication, in memory of our perished children. Let's see if this will take me back. Okay. Oh, we're going back too far. So Gnesin's trio sorry, I'm trigger happy. Okay, here we go. Gnesin's trio is composed over the course of 1942 and 1943. It's debuted in Moscow in 1944. It's published in Moscow, the edition you see here, in 1947. One of the interesting things about this piece of music is it's by a composer who, to my knowledge, and I'm prepared to be told right now that I'm wrong, is the only composer to be banned effectively by both the Soviets and the Nazi regime, or I should say to be targeted. His music was formally listed in the 1935 Nazi list of banned composers, and in the Soviet context, he went on to watch as his brother and many of his close friends were arrested and murdered, and to watch at various times his own career derailed as he was forced into a forced retirement, and his own music facing many moments of unofficial repression. And yet, Gnesin is an interesting case because he was a very well-known figure in the Soviet Union. He continued to be revered in many circles, and not once but twice he's effectively rescued and evacuated by the Soviets from the advancing Nazi forces. To understand how this could happen, I want to take a step back and give you a few brief details about his biography. Gnesin is one of these composers who Michael Haas referred to in his remarks yesterday as part of this Jewish National School or St. Petersburg School. The nomenclature always is subject to interpretation and debate. But he's of the generation that grows up around 1905. He's a disciple of Rimsky-Korsakov and Glazunov. He's there sitting just to the left of Rimsky-Korsakov. And he's the generation that sees themselves as the next carrying on the torch of the 19th century Russian tradition. And yet he also is of the generation that begins to embrace this idea of Jewish art music and having a national school just as the Russians and all the other peoples have. Sorry, once again, I've gone too fast. Gnesin is somebody who pursues this dual identity, so to speak, in the years before World War I. And I just can't get it today. And he does this through writing works that are very much of a piece with this new moment of early Russian modernism, and at the same time engaging in this overt mission of creating Jewish art music using folkloric materials. Right? And one of the things I emphasize in my writing about him is he really tries to pursue this as a kind of dual patrimony, that because he's in a Russian empire where he's being told, you're Russian, but you're not really Russian, but you're a minority nationality.
you can do both. You can contribute into this stream of Russian music by writing your own difference into your music, which will then be part of Russian music. And he occupies these many different spaces. Gnesin is someone who thinks early in his career about anti-Semitism. In fact, he faces it from the day he arrives in Moscow to go to the conservatory, and only to find out that he can't get into the conservatory as a Jew. And he switches to St. Petersburg, where he then finds his mentor, Rimsky-Korsakov. He's someone who faces anti-Semitism directly because he encounters it in strange encounters with people like Stravinsky, who is also competing for the mantle of Rimsky-Korsakov's great student, because of his involvement in revolutionary politics and because of his travels also to Palestine before World War I. If you fast forward to the revolutionary years, Gnesin sees the revolution as a chance, again, to sort of square the circle, to have Jewish art music in the Soviet context. He believes in the revolution and he believes in Jewish nationalism. And believing deeply in both puts him in a very difficult position. And yet, he's somebody who rises to the fore in the 1920s as one of the leading composers, right? He simultaneously has the distinction of being connected to Rimsky-Korsakov and the pre-revolutionary school, and he has the right politics, at least in parts of the 1920s. What happens to him? Well, Gnesin is one of the interesting stories because he continues to be revered and revered, but his music begins to disappear in the 1930s from the concert repertoire, and he begins to face political attacks and pressures in this moment. And then the war arrives. Siege of Leningrad, he is evacuated, he flees with his family, I should say, and then they make it further into Soviet territory outside of Leningrad, and then they make it all the way to Tashkent, where they end up with a whole bunch of composers and artists who've been evacuated there at this point in time. To be more precise, in late September 1941, Gnesin and his family flee to Yoshkar-Ola on the Volga River. And then the following summer, they join the rest of the Leningrad Conservatory faculty in Tashkent. But Gnesin's son, who was a grown man, 35 years old, did not survive the journey. He arrived in Tashkent before Gnesin, but by the time Gnesin got there, his son, Fabi, had died and was already dead in late 1942. So this brings us to the piece of music we heard and we're talking about. Now, in one sense, giving the dedication in memory of our perished children fits something that we would open any textbook and we would know this is how Soviet music works. This is how Soviet culture works during the war. The personal is transmuted into the collective, right? And this is actually a very creative way of taking this tragedy and saying this is about all the dead children as part of a patriotic sentiment. This piece, as I told you, was actually premiered in Tashkent in '43 and then in Moscow the year later. And as it entered into Soviet musical life, Gnesin appeared to just reinforce this statement. In public statements about it, he said that this is something about all of our children who suffered, those at the hands of the murderous occupiers and those who suffered on the privations of the war. And it seems to reflect that sentiment, that he's taken his own experience of grief and he's made it into a Soviet struggle. I'm not even going to get into the question of what sounds Jewish, but suffice it to say that Gnesin wrote a lot of other music where he used explicit markers and folkloric material, and he called it that. This is a piece of music which he didn't give any indication in the score or in his presentation of it publicly that this is something he would call Jewish or that he drew on Jewish folkloric material for it. Now, I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm not going to dwell on that, but we'll come back to it, and I think Michael will talk about that. Here's another cover shot of the piece of music. Here is the title page with the dedication, Pamяти наших погибших детей, dedicated to the memory of our lost or perished children. Now, that's the public image of the piece. Where the story starts to become more complicated and takes us into this open secret dynamic is, and here's another shot of another draft of it, is with this. Because it turns out Gnesin actually took the opening theme from a very well-known Yiddish folk song, Amolets Gewene Yidela. a known folk song that had been published multiple times in Poland, that had circulated in the Soviet Union, and that is not just a folk song, not just a Jewish motif, but a folk song with a very specific kind of message. And these are the lyrics, very simple lyrics. I'm actually going to play a short clip with a talented young musicologist, a student, Professor Beckerman, Sam Ziering, who kindly lent his voice to this 15-second clip. And I'm going to ask for help from the back to cue it, because I'm having bad luck with my technical fingers here. Can you launch it for me?
Ist das gerade so gestorben, gestorben, gestorben.
So there it is, right? Now, what you need to know is that a kaddischal is a Yiddish word which means more than simply a little son. Kaddischal refers to Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, and it refers to, the term kaddischal refers to a son because the son was understood to have the obligation to say the mourner's prayer for his departed father, i.e. the parent dies, the child grieves and mourns. And this prayer this is a very religious thing, and more than just religious. In some contexts in Yiddish or Ashkenazic culture, you would say it has theurgic properties, because dating way back into the medieval period, you have an idea that saying the Kaddish can redeem the soul of the departed one. So there's a lot of heavy, heavy religious connotation built into this. And of course, this is it's a beautiful song that plays on the irony that the son dies first, right? The son dies first instead of the father, the way it's supposed to be. So this is what Gnesin uses for his opening melody. That's the motif. We know this because he says it, and he actually writes a letter in 1943 to his sister, one of many sisters of his who gave us the Gnesin Institute in Moscow. And he says, this is the version, what I'm going to tell you now is the version of the song that I can't show to the world. He says, I got this folk song from an ethnographer in Moscow. We know this to be the ethnographer Dobrushin, who also gave Shostakovich his texts. And then he goes on to say, this is a song, this is a composition composed of different parts. The first is this song, the second is a melody, and this is a melody actually, Michael, I think, may show you in the score, the second melody that he says he got from his son, and that his son composed as a young boy. And that's the only personal note in the score, is that this melody is marked as from my son when he was 9 years old. And then he says, there's a whole meaning to this which has to do with the different phases of youth, and then the struggle of death, and then nostalgia for childhood, and then the third theme of love. Now, again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to do too much specific discussion of that. But what I want to do is just lay this out there and ask the question that I've written about and that I continue to ponder, which is how do we think about this piece of music? Here we have somebody who clearly said, I'm going to write a piece of music commemorating my personal experience, linking it up to the war effort, and it has to meet the dictates of the moment. On the other hand, here we have a piece of music where Gnesin understood that many of his listeners would understand that there's a musical reference there to something which would be potentially extremely provocative and extremely even problematic to use this song if the text were known. I want to argue, as I've argued previously about him, that what you have here is something which is a deliberate dualism, right? And dualism, thanks to Professor Taruskin, we know is not something that is unknown in Soviet music, but it's very striking when you think about how it is used here to write this kind of music, which, as I said in my opening, might be about the Holocaust and not about the Holocaust. It can be both because he can do these different layers to it. And therefore, it doesn't fit neatly into any of the categories we like to use to talk about this, be it repressed music or Holocaust music. This gets into the last thing I want to say a few remarks about this portion of the program, which is, okay, how was it heard? And there we get a very interesting phenomenon. In the 1940s, at the moment of its appearance, it was frequently discussed as a piece that was both Jewish and Soviet. In Sovietskaya Muzika in 1946, Gnesin's pupil wrote that his music, all of it, but this and a couple of other pieces written at the time, also without specific Jewish monikers, labels, and whatnot, were part of a, quote, hidden program. So in the Soviet Musicological Journal, she can say that this is a hidden program which describes the particular tragic fate, quote, of the Jewish people with Jewish melodies. Soviet Yiddish language writing similarly talks about this. In 1948, he's described as both a fervent patriot of the socialist fatherland and a composer whose output is closely linked to his people. So he can be both, and it can be both about the Jewish suffering and about something else. This fits actually with what we now know was not atypical of this moment, when, as scholars have done recently, looking at film, it's very interesting to think about, I think it was Michael who spoke yesterday, Michael Haas, about the representation of the Holocaust in German film. Well, we now know, thanks to a couple scholars, that there were scores of movies about the Holocaust that came out in the Soviet Union, some repressed, some not. During the war, even before the war officially, about the Nazis, and during the war and after. We know also there was a huge output of writing by poets, some of them who would turn out to be punished and murdered for it, about their Jewishness in Yiddish and in Russian. And much of this work has escaped our attention not simply because it was repressed or its authors and creators were repressed, but because it was in fact hidden in plain sight since it used its own dual language, which made sense in that context but doesn't appear to us to fit the category that dictates of Holocaust culture. Because it doesn't single out the Jewish experience, because it often submerges it inside something like this piece of music does. Now, what's interesting about this kind of submergence is it's a disguise which often becomes permanent. What happens to Gnesin's piece of music after 1948? Well, 48 is a bad year for all music in the Soviet Union, and it's a bad year in particular for Gnesin and for Jewish composers and musicians. He continues to be outspoken in his politics. He continues to be one of the few people who will stand up to the Zhdanov and the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, which is beginning in Soviet culture then. And he's one of the people who fully expects to be punished for it, but nonetheless continues to speak out. He is punished. He is forced out of his job and forced into retirement. And yet his music sort of both lives on and doesn't live on in official Soviet musical culture. So for instance, in the late 50s, when the history of Russian-Soviet music is published, when they have the chapter about wartime instrumental works, they mention this trio, both at the beginning and the end. And they single it out as an exceptional achievement. It has succeeded as a piece of music to, quote, present a programmatic depiction of the struggles and sufferings of man and of the highest humanitarian ideals of the Soviet people. The Jewishness is gone, but the piece can still be celebrated. And it goes on to be celebrated as part of the tradition of elegiac trios by Tchaikovsky, Arensky, and Rachmaninoff. Interesting to think about that in the 50s. It's even possible, and in some cases still happens, that people refer to its Jewish audible sonorities, but say they are not really Jewish. So, for instance, Julian Crane, the composer, in 1961 writes about the piece and says, what this is a piece of Russian Orientalism. And he goes on to say that really what Gnesin has written is a piece that is part of the tradition of Glinka and Rimsky-Korsakov and actually Shostakovich of the non-Jewish Russians borrowing these folkloric motifs, and therefore they are somewhat more kosher, right? And what's interesting about this is it continues even into the post-Soviet period. Yosef Rizhkin, one of Gnesin's disciples, in 2004 talks about this piece and says this is a very important piece about remembering the loss of children. Now, Rizhkin actually is Jewish, also was involved in writing Jewish music at different parts of his career, but he doesn't hear this as Jewish. And he makes a statement in which he says, this is a piece that should be played every year to commemorate the days for the defense of children. He puts it in a very Russian-Soviet context. Now, the last reception anecdote I want to bring before concluding this portion of my remarks is how it's heard outside the Soviet Union. And here I think we can begin to get into something very interesting, which is not just exile before and after for composers, posthumous reputations, post-exilic reputations, but also how memory and interpretation operates in almost a multi-spatial way. Right? I think it might even been mentioned yesterday. Michael Rothberg, a contemporary scholar who writes about Holocaust memory, emphasizes how it can flow outwards at different paces in different directions all at once, as opposed to the way we typically think about it when we continue to talk about the Holocaust in music in terms of the light bulb motif. You know, one could not speak of this, one could not write about this, and then one could, and then it comes on. And then we even historicize ourselves by saying, in this moment, we can now talk about it. When in reality, it may be much more like a series of waves and stops and starts that flow through. This is a letter that was sent to Gnesin in 1948. It's from Poland, next door. And it's from the Central Committee of Jews in Poland, informing Gnesin they have the pleasure to let him know that for the commemoration of the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, his piano trio, and I've put the phrase here, your piano trio dedicated to the murdered Jewish children, was performed on Polish radio. And here's just a close-up for those who want to peer into the Yiddish. What does this mean? Well, it's, again, a very, very complicated story. This is a moment when Stalinization is beginning in Poland. The person who writes this letter, Hirsch Smolar, is a central figure in the communist Polish Jewish leadership who had spent time in the Soviet Union, who had led the partisans in Minsk, and who had returned to take over leadership of the Polish Jewish community and aspired to build a relationship to the Soviet Jewish cultural leadership. This is the moment when some of that leadership had already begun to be rounded up and targeted and executed. And Smolar himself, within somewhat between 6 to 8 months of writing this, was beginning to denounce fellow Jews for their bourgeois nationalism and use terms that we would consider to be exterminationist language about the need to eliminate the cockroaches of the Zionists from the midst of our society. So this is a complicated moment in which somebody nevertheless is saying something that was never said in any of the writing about the trio in the Soviet Union, which is that this is about Jewish children as opposed to Soviet children. So what does this point to? It's not just about the complexities of interpretation, but I think the point is, in real time, the Holocaust sounds very different in the Soviet Union. And it doesn't just sound different because the Jews there are not in the camps. It's because their cultural universe and the way they think about what music can mean, leaving aside even just politics or anti-Semitism, is different because they're in an imperial context where identities can be multiple in a different way. And they're understood that they can do that, and because they have developed a tradition of encoding which already predates the World War II. And that doubleness is a strategy of survival in one sense. Now, I could go on about this, but I'm just going to kind of unceremoniously cut myself off and invite Michael Beckerman to come up and take us a little bit further into this by talking about how this may or may not be reflected in the music, and how we can understand more precisely, beyond my generalizations about what Gnesin wanted to do and how he did it and what he may have said about doing it, how the piece actually operates. Because, of course, that's the other challenge to all of this, not just to recover it, but to try and understand what he was intending to do and then how we can interpret it. And, of course, the biggest question, which is, how does this affect how we hear it today? So let me pause here and invite Mike to come up.
Thank you very much. Am I on?
Yeah.
I'm on. And I wonder if I could have my first slide. Thanks. I'm very grateful to James bringing this piece to my attention, and we've spoken about it quite a bit, and it's been quite exciting. You always wonder what a piece of music is about, and so now you know. This is the way Gnesin was meant to be seen. No. I thought that one of the things I would do would just be in a very prosaic way, take you through some of the characters in this piece and point out a couple of things and make a couple of remarks. We'll see if I have better luck with this. Okay, good. All right. Well, we'll begin at the beginning. Let's just begin, and the trio is kind enough to demonstrate some of these passages. And of course, I should have known that and gotten those really ugly little speakers off the screen, but what can you do? So let's begin at the beginning. We know what it is. Now, let me just briefly say something which I'm sure will be evident to all of you. These are tricky issues. If we have a piece with 5 themes, and the composer tells us what 2 of them are, do we know more about the piece because we know about those 2 themes, or do we suddenly feel like we know a lot less because there are 3 themes we don't know anything about? So, you know, we always have to think about this, but let's just begin at the beginning with the opening. That's fine. And so that's the opening, as James has shown. This is certainly taken from this song with a very specific text about a child who died. One of the things we always ask ourselves, and unfortunately we can't answer it with a great deal of clarity, is how does instrumental music speak? And what happens to the speech of instrumental music when you quote a piece with a text? Does the instrumental piece then have a secondary text which can be considered to be part of its meaning, or we don't know. So, but we do know that Gnesin, this was important to Gnesin to use this song for personal symbolic reasons, to communicate with a select small group, that it has to do with this issue. Then I've put this next theme in blue because I don't know what it is. It kind of interrupts, it seems like almost a kind of, by contrast, a kind of idyllic moment that comes to a sudden kind of hopeless end. So let's play, this is 2 after rehearsal 3. It's got a drone, sweet intervals, and then it just sort of goes to pieces. So that's this, which becomes a kind of important theme. Now, the purple part is this entire first opening section, aside from that little interruption, is iterations of various parts of the Jewish song theme. Over and over again, little bits of it. Then there's this theme, let's go let's do 2 after rehearsal 4. And this is the purple, the sort of iterations of the Jewish theme. Okay, now another thing that might make it Jewish is its variable modality. Could you just play the opening, just the first 4 measures, and then I'll ask you to play that passage again. Okay, so that's with the G natural, and now the theme from the, yeah. right? So he's using variants of that theme. Then we have, the andantino, that's 2 after 12. If you thought that somehow that was a childlike theme or something to do with children, there's some evidence for that, which I'll show you in a moment, but this is, again, you'll notice that the form of this is somewhat loosely palindromic. Considering that it's subtitled Quasi una ballata, one's first idea was to try to figure out how this could ever be an ABBAA verse form from the Renaissance, but we'll come to that in a moment, because it's obviously not. The third theme that again occurs is this andante cantabile, that's 3 after 17, kind of the love theme of the piece. Thank you. So that's this third theme. It's quite primitive, but I use these stripes for developmental episodes. I don't know camp connotations, but so if we could take the andante at 1 after 22, that takes this theme that we heard at the beginning, that little pastoral interruption, and sort of has a quasi-development with it. So if we could do again 1 after 22. Sorry, a bad stop. I apologize. And then the next is a kind of a developmental passage that's based on the main theme. That's 3 after 25. That's fine. Let's leave that for a moment. I want to skip ahead and see if this works. This is the composer's by a little note about the piece. The author strove not only to express our shared pain about our children, this is Gnesin writing, students and young friends who perished in battles for our fatherland or were tortured by the enemy in occupied cities. He sought to stir up in the memory of listeners the image of these living young people, of their youth, from childhood dreams and play, from youthful unrequited love and aspirations to the very first real adult achievements and sudden deaths. The sections of the trio linked to the poetry of the children's sufferings are built on the theme composed at age 8 by the son of the composer, Fabi, now deceased. So this is in the score, the andantino that you heard. This is 2 after 12. Maybe you could just play that again. Yeah. So this, and it says in the score, there's an asterisk, theme composed by my son Fabi. And we were saying, you know, what kind of instructions are those to a performer? So you got pianissimo, semplice, and composed for my dead son, or quoting, I mean, you know, what is a performer? It's put in the score almost as if it's a performance instruction. What do you do with it? But clearly, that's the theme that is here in the yellow, in this sort of interior spot, and also comes back in an unusual way. Let's take the rehearsal 41. Rehearsal 41. In that moment, he combines, and I put it with the purple stripes on the yellow, sorry, Fabi's theme with the Jewish child theme. You know, one can overread it, one doesn't know that it's an explicit conflation of the Jewish child who died with his own son at this particular moment. And I'm going to point out this little pink thing, which I'll ask them to play in a moment. Again, because it is quite a strange and I think quite interesting moment. And so let's hear that. That's the Poco Meno 4 before 37. We'll start before this. Yeah, 4 before 37. So there's this passage right in the middle, sort of doesn't make use of any preceding material. In my own thinking, which you probably have heard enough about, you know, this is a sort of a classic interior middle moment, something hidden. You know, I can't say what the intention is, but certainly considering Gnesin's remarks about the piece, one can understand that he's talking about the death, and you have these sort of little funereal, everything stops for a moment. And again, when we tell the story, as this piece tells the story, it's not a story once upon a time from beginning to end. It seems to be a story that's telling itself from the inside out in this palindromic form. Again, we have formally, and then at the end, we have this interior moment, which I've put in pink, and then the themes palindromically go backwards, except for this other interrupted moment where the Fabi theme and the Jewish child theme combine in this moment. And then there's a conclusion. Let's hear it, the 5 after 48. Or let's hear 3 before 46, the yellow. Yeah, 3 before 46. Final reminiscence of Fabi. Okay, thank you. And then 5 after 48, the last, the return of the theme, the Jewish child theme as a kind of dirge. So again, formally to me, this is something I see in a lot of pieces that seem to be written in a censoring environment, self-censoring environment, with these vibrant interiors that seem to have all kinds of coded meanings that one can grapple with in one way or another. Inexplicable things that don't seem to be part of the harmonic logic of the piece, but seem to have extraordinary personal or symbolic resonance. I only have two more things to say. Two slides. One, because as many of you know, I do some work on Czech music. It wouldn't be fair to deprive you of the notion that there seem to be two pieces in the universe, if somebody knows more, let me know, called quasi una ballata, and they both just happen to be single movement piano trios. The first was written by the Czech composer Vítězslav Novák. It was published by Zimrock, and it's likely that Gnesin encountered it somehow in Berlin when he was there in 1911. We don't know for sure, but we think that the ballata refers to an elegy, an elegiac Italian form, but we don't know much about it. But the two of them are kind of elegiac pieces, Andante Tragico, and we know that this piece by Gnesin has very clear tragic tones in it. The second slide I'll show you might or might not suggest something about the resonance of this particular piece and maybe some insider knowledge of what this theme means. Many of you are familiar with the preludes and fugues of Shostakovich, and many of you who are familiar with the final fugue, which is much, much longer and elaborate than the others, and I just want to suggest that here there's a connection between the Gnesin, which of course you heard. Now I've cheated, of course, by taking off the key signature, so this is actually, with 5 flats, but here's, well, let's start with this. And then I have to turn, the only way I can turn it off with this is that, and then here's. So again, there's no way to prove it. There's lots of sort of scammy research that says this sounds like that, but I think there's certainly a possibility here that Shostakovich knew this piece and knew what the song was and used this as a subject for the final fugue. Thank you very much. One of the things that we regret, but it happens all too often, is that while we speak, the musicians, aside from doing what we ask them to do, are turned into mutes, which is not our intention. Maybe no, it's not our intention, certainly. But I thought if they wouldn't mind, if they had any comments, it's not fair to ask them to assimilate any of this and suddenly come up with a different interpretation. But what, if anything, do these kinds of stories suggest to you, or how do they resonate? If any of you would be interested in speaking to that or willing to.
Yeah, I think knowing about the origin of the first song at the beginning really gives, at least to me, it gives a whole different understanding of the whole piece, a different meaning and a different emotion. Because when we learned this piece, we sort of purposely didn't know anything about it. We didn't research anything about it. We went and learned it from just the score without any historical or background knowledge. And yeah, I'm interested to see how we'll play it now after everything that you have explained.
I actually had I had no idea that where the first theme came from until just now. And actually, when I first heard this piece, I'd never even heard of the composer before. And, I remember thinking, for Russian music, this is very colorful, and the harmonies are really evocative and almost like French in a little way. But knowing now the theme, the context of the theme, I can see it as more of a maybe denser kind of, a little less, I don't know how to put it into words, but it's definitely, there's a different light cast on it.
But definitely understanding the ideas behind all the themes helps us with what's probably one of the biggest challenges of this piece, which was putting it together as a whole. In the rehearsals, he always keeps moving the tempo back and forth, agitato, piumoso, allargando, so this gives us a better idea of why he's doing this and where he's heading. Even if it's obvious on the score, understanding the idea behind definitely helps a lot. Yeah.
So let me ask the follow-up. Is there a danger with this? Does this pose problems? If you have a passage that already says molto espressivo, and then you have an asterisk, and says done, recalling my dead son Fabi, is there a danger that one would try to overplay it or to think too much about it, or that it could move one away from an idea that one has about the piece that's completely legitimate but could steer you in a wrong direction? And do you have to think about that as well?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what's a wrong direction. I think knowing this kind of thing maybe would affect kind of overall interpretation. And personally, I wouldn't be too worried about. Well, I don't know, actually.
I say that because, I know that this Gideon-Klein trio, and it begins, with a kind of Moravian song, ba 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 ba, and it's like if you tell people, well, did you know that this composer wrote this in a concentration camp? Could you play it again? Bum bum bum. And did you know that he was taken to Auschwitz and died? Bum bum. So you get to a point where there's a kind of maudlin or potentially sort of over-affected interpretation that one feels some responsibility to the story. That really carries one away from certain kinds of musical instincts. That's sort of what I meant.
Well, originally I was going to say that knowing that his dead son wrote that is more, to me it's more like a fact. I don't think it would affect the way that I would play it as much, because just the way that it's written is very innocent and it's written semplice and everything. And to me, I wouldn't add anything extra. I think the music speaks for itself almost in a way, and it's nice. I mean, it's interesting to know that he wrote that. But
I was just going to say that we actually, before today, we'd already been talking about how these kind of innocent sections are, they're almost more like memories than something that's actually like happening in the present. So I think the composer wrote it into the music already without needing to know this kind of thing. But it definitely is at the very least interesting to know about.
Thank you. Okay, well, let me take this away. I'm going to turn it over to Jim to make a couple of comments before we pass it again to the musicians.
Sure. I just want to, observe a couple things. What's interesting about this is when I first heard, I remember being in St. Petersburg and first hearing the story about the first theme before I'd read anything in the archives about it from someone from the Jewish community there. And I remember I reacted with deep skepticism when they said, well, it's all based on a Yiddish song, because that is a story we hear so many times, right, about music from this period, that it must be Jewish, it must have something He must have, because look at him. And I was also skeptical because, as it turns out, the second theme, Fabi's theme, his son's theme, he didn't simply pull that out of the scraps of paper in his son's pockets that were there in Tashkent. He'd used the theme before. He used it in 1923, Gnesin did, in his aborted first opera, Abram's Youth, which was an opera he wrote when he was outside of Jerusalem. The second time he went to Palestine after World War I, after the revolution, after pledging himself to this cause, he still was drawn there because in many respects he had a Zionist sentiment. Labeling him this or that is complicated, but he began this opera, which he brought back with him, and this theme, as he notes actually in other writings of this period in World War II, this theme was written by his son, his dead son, but he used it once before. And that opera was not completed, largely because of political reasons, but other things having to do with his own struggles as a composer. So again, for me, I would say, to put myself in the position of confessional mode, I was skeptical too about how do we understand what his motivations are, even when he writes to his sister and tells her what this means and what this means. Because of course he's also alluding to the fact that he's already worked with this material once before, and he didn't simply seize on it, or maybe it's appropriate to say that music that had a different meaning for him when his son composed it years before, suddenly could be reinterpreted. One of the things that's happening, just to give you even more things to overdetermine the meaning of this piece, if you read his correspondence during this moment, and you read this correspondence of people around him, he's a broken man. He feels like he's done as a composer, but he owes it, he says, to Fabi and to the country to finish this piece and a couple other pieces he writes at the time for larger ensembles. People around him, Maximilian Steinberg and other friends of his, are very nervous that Gnesin is about to, keel over from the stress of it. And there's this other notion that basically he, the composer, is in a very fragile state. To some extent, he's telling everyone he is, and to some extent, they're seeing him. And that fragility may have actually nothing to do with, again, the Nazis, and may have nothing to do even with the conditions of Jews and Jewish culture, and may have a lot more to do with the fact that this was a man at the end of his career who was physically exhausted, who was basically living in the lobby of the main theater in Tashkent, suffering kind of in a material, physical way. And all of that is in the piece too, which again, whether we call that war, whether we call that music of war, whether we call that music that reflects his experiences suffering under war, is one of these very complicated things. It's different to be in Tashkent than to be in the blockade in Leningrad. To be in Tashkent after the war is actually to be marked as someone who sat out the war, as many of the anti-Semitic innuendo, and not so much implicit but explicit, assaults and tropes about Jews and the Jewish intelligentsia went, which was that the Jews had it easy. They didn't fight on the front. In fact, they did. But all these intellectuals got to go to Tashkent, and they got to sit out the war while the rest of us suffered in the cities. So all of that is operating inside this too in terms of his biography, and leaves us with this challenge about where do we put that in, and how do we program this, and so on and so forth. So with that, I'm happy to join Mike in inviting the trio to play the piece through one more time for us, and then we can hear it now with lots of layers of interpretation and information, and decide for ourselves where it fits as a recovered piece of music.
clear the stage and give everybody a chance to regroup. We'll call a 10-minute break. You can stay in place, wander around. Well, yes? Well, we're not. Did you hear the question? For the others, the question is, now that you've experienced this new piece of music, do you feel that this is a work you would carry with you in repertoire for the rest of your performing career, do you think?
Sure, I don't see, yeah, why not? It's an incredibly beautiful piece. It's a shame that nobody really knows it, so, yeah.
Yeah, the question is, where can you hear more of this music? The answer is, there are some of Gnesin's songs. In fact, I just got an email. Some of the songs are being performed in New York in a few days by a Dutch ensemble that's put out, I think, at least one CD of his songs, his art songs. There's a Russian CD from many years ago, which featured some other chamber works of his. He wrote a bunch of theater music. He worked a lot with Mikhail, the great avant-garde theater director. Most of his work, unhappily, is still unrecorded, but happily there are many artists, including some who are attending the conference, that are exploring his chamber works and are performing them and are, preparing recordings of them. So there is more out there, and we hope that's the whole point of this conference. We hope that more musicians will take up the task of recording it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.